100%.
We got to now. We're to the big boy.
Oh yeah.
We're to the so Chris. There's smoke coming out of his ears already. He's boiling. Mr. Doring, I'm sure you're very passionate about your elimination here, your ejection. Who would like to start? Who's on? Are you on the edge of your seat? We need somebody to kick us off with a bang because I've been waiting. You guys are very passionate. We're all very passionate about things that we really make us angry when it comes to sports. I need somebody to hit us to start us off with a bang.
Let's mix it up. Chris, you go first.
Oh, okay. All right. On the spot. Here we go. All right. Mine is very unsurprisingly baseball related again. And it is somehow, like Josh pointed out, above Rob Manfred in my list of frustrations. So it is my ejection. It is not a simple, easy thing to just get rid of. So that's why it's a little tricky, because it's not as simple as just change this rule and the problem's fixed. But my ejection thing that really annoys me about baseball is the retaliation of teams by throwing at or near batters, particularly near batters' heads, because it is dangerous, it is stupid, and it is reckless. I understand that, this all stems from, as you might be able to guess, the incident that happened with Joe Kelly and the Dodgers. Joe Kelly throwing near the head of Alex Bregman of the Astros, of course, retaliation for the Astros sign stealing scandal and that whole situation. The Dodgers and many other teams, of course, baseball, and many people across baseball were upset that the Dodgers players did not receive any individual punishment for the sign stealing scandal because of the deal that was made between the players and the league in investigating. And so the players were upset about it. And so they decided to, as has happened so many times in the history of baseball, take it into their own hands. Joe Kelly, of course, he saw the meme of him taunting Carlos Correa and the picture of that going around. And then he throws a pitch that goes near Alex Bregman's head. And many people came to his defense after he was suspended for a significant period of time by the commissioner's office. Players came to his defense, free Joe Kelly, all these things, because they, felt that that was the way that the players could take the matter into their own hands, because they weren't happy about the Astros players not being suspended. But the bottom line for me is it's incredibly dangerous to throw near someone's head. These pitchers are throwing 95 miles an hour. It's just not the way to retaliate. I understand that there aren't clear, easy ways to, express your frustration with the opponent. You can't like get really energized and just dunk on them. I mean, in baseball, there's few ways to do it other than just channeling your energy to hit a home run, which isn't that simple. But just this idea that you can, that's an appropriate form of retaliation. It's dangerous, because someone could really get hurt, and that's not the risk that should not be allowed. And so I think it was a good thing. Well, that punishment for Kelly was strict. I think that baseball should continue to enact strong punishments for players who throw near batters' heads, because it's dangerous. And one of these days it could really get someone significantly hurt. I just think it's reckless, and it should go. And baseball should continue to make it clear with punishments that it's not acceptable. The end. Rant over.
Wow. I'm satisfied with the beginning of this part of the podcast. Very satisfied. Yeah, you're exactly right. Go ahead, Josh.
I'm with you. My question was just going to be, and not that there has to be an alternative, but what is the other option? How do you fix this? Because it's so ingrained, and that doesn't make it right, and it is incredibly dangerous. But what else is there? How do you feel like you can protect yourself? Which obviously the answer to that is not putting somebody else in danger,
right?
But what is the alternative? I was curious. So you sort of said, there is an easy one. I was curious if you had thoughts on something to sort of appease the people who want to be able to stand up for themselves, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. I mean, it's the $1 million question. I don't have a way that you could just turn your frustration into, don't throw near them, because, like some people could say, well, just throw a little inside, don't throw near their head. But we've seen that that's just not that simple. Even the best pitchers with the best control, it's reckless to just be throwing around near someone anyway, because, obviously that's not a solution. But I mean, you're right. There's not a tricky, like I said, there's no, let's just, go dunk on them and, or you show them. But, I think from the perspective of getting it to stop, I think that's what sort of, again, stopping it completely is tricky. But what the commissioner's office did and the baseball did in suspending Kelly for an extended period of time is making a statement. And having harsh punishments is going to decrease the amount of times that's going to happen. That being said, your question being, what do they do instead? I don't know. Something that's not risking people's lives, preferably, but I don't know.
You would hope that, I mean, the answer here is for Major League Baseball's commissioner's office to make punishments that fit the crime and that are
right.
That please players. Now, they don't make decisions, they don't make day-to-day decisions necessarily to please players, but you would hope, because in this case in particular, I don't think Joe Kelly would have thrown it at his head if Astros players were individually punished for their role in the cheating scandal. I don't, and which is your point. As for, because you're right, in a game if somebody hits a home run off of you and then talks smack to you around the bases, if you're a pitcher, there's nothing you can do other than make sure he knows whose plate it is and to assert your dominance by throwing one high and tight. That's the answer to that is I'm there almost might not be an answer, but I think the first step is whether it's intentional or not, and maybe that's not fair. Maybe if there's a plurality to balls thrown at a head, maybe you lose, if you lose command of one pitch as a major league pitcher, and it skies over their head, you let a curveball go too early and it goes over his head. But if it's the same guy against the same batter in the same game multiple times, that's not an accident. You can't tell me that's an accident. I refuse to believe it. So maybe it starts with a rule that says, okay, if there's a plurality to it and one, rather to, multiple batters in a row or the same batter in the same game, then we're just sort of spitballing here and it already is getting very complex. But there has to be some sort of accountability just to fix the problem in the future rather than specifically this issue with the Astros and the cheating scandal, to start with some sort of legislation that says, that very specifically lays out what kind of consequences you're going to have if you throw out somebody's head.
Yeah, that's a good point. Of course, it's going to be tricky, like you said, and that it's hard to get completely objective, because there'll always be, you set a strict rule, but how do you define it? What got too close to someone's head, or it's tricky. But I completely agree that would be, in a ideal situation. I guess sort of my last overall thought about it is just, I don't mind so much players being really expressive on the field, whether that is a bat flip or making faces. I mean, I understand that teams are going to get upset if you're taunting. I mean, I understand, but I feel like there's just a major difference between players being really expressive and, what words they choose, the faces they make, celebrations, whatever that be, that's relatively harmless, right? These are just expressions of frustration or joy or whatever versus taking an action that's endangering someone's life. So I say any way to funnel things into, get as mad as you want, make whatever stupid faces you want at the other
baseball
team.
Fun.
Right. Embrace the fact that let players be expressive. Just don't let them endanger other players' safety, basically, is final overall broad thought.
And the other problem is that it's not like, for the most part, hitting somebody solves anything. Because guess what?
Right.
Then you're just going to go get one of your teammates hit.
It's just going back and forth. It doesn't solve the problem. What is it solving? Yeah, right.
There's players I don't feel like are very good at sort of restraining themselves and actually adjudicating things, even within this strange, problematic baseball unwritten rule universe.
Right.
Things don't just end. It's not, oh, okay, I understand why that happened, so we need to stop this now. It's, well, my teammate just got hit, so now I got to go protect my teammate.
Right.
Right.
There's no end to it. Yeah.
Mr.
All right,
Doring.
Mr. Doring, what's yours? Yeah.
My ejection is automatic bids for college basketball tournament champions.
Yes.
I should have known.
Yes.
I should have known.
Yes.
This bothers me so much. And this is why it took that long for a 16 seed to beat a 1. It's not because the 16 seeds are that much worse, or like specifically because those conferences are that much worse than your Big Tens and ACCs. It's because the teams that these conferences are sending are average teams in the SWAC.
That got
They're
hot
not-
for the right weekend.
Right.
Exactly.
They just won a couple games, and all of a sudden they're playing North Carolina or Duke or Kansas or whoever. That's why this took so long for UMBC to finally beat Virginia. And it was only because it was a Virginia team that was
It was
capable
a perfect
of,
storm.
right, exactly. And it's also just disrespectful to mid-majors because you don't let them represent themselves with their best teams.
Mhm.
Maybe if your SWACs of the world got to send their best team, we might feel a little different about them.
Mhm.
But because you only have one automatic bid, you have to be just the best team on that weekend or that extended 8-day period or 4-day period or whatever it might be. So here's your example from the Big West. Long Beach State and UC Irvine have won 7 of the last 10 regular season titles in this conference.
Okay.
They have 3 combined NCAA tournament appearances, one of which came in a year where neither of them actually won the conference.
Lit.
That conference has had 4 regular season champions in 10 years, 8 tournament champions in 9 years because they didn't have a tournament this year. And only UC Irvine has made the tournament more than one time in the past 10 years. Well, 9 tournaments from this conference.
Even though there's clearly 2 best teams in this conference over the last 10 years.
Right. And just let's get so my not only is it an ejection of automatic conference tournament champions, it's then giving that bid to the regular season champion.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you actually get the best teams in March Madness. I'm not saying we kick mid-major conferences out. I'm saying let's actually get good mid-major teams in there so that you're not just determined by one weekend.
So then, and I agree with you before what I'm about to say. I absolutely agree with you. My question is, what role do our conference tournaments just like, what do you do with conference tournaments then? Because I suppose it's just more resume strengthening. But then do you do that, or do you just add 4 games to the end of the conference schedule for everybody, or add 3 games or 2 games, or what would you foresee the conference tournament, what role the conference tournament would play when it essentially would mean absolutely nothing at that point? Because the only argument here, I think that at least that I can fathom, is with the current way it works, both the tournament and the regular season and the conference carry weight. The regular season carrying the bulk of your resume weight, and then the conference tournament you can still get in as an auto bid. The other way around, I mean, unless you're an ACC team beating Duke in the ACC tournament, and that win gets you in to the tournament when you otherwise wouldn't, there's not a whole lot of use for the conference tournament at that point. So along with that rule, what role would the conference tournament play?
Sure. I'm glad you asked. Here's my answer.
Tell me.
So first thing is, if you win a conference tournament, automatic bid to the NIT.
Okay.
Which is essentially what's happening. And I'm not sure about this, but I believe at least most conferences, regular season, if you don't make the NCAA tournament, you do have an auto bid to the NIT. That's sort of how the NIT builds some of its field.
Okay.
Mhm.
So that way you do have something to play for. For your smaller conferences, the NIT is still an incentive that is real and means something.
I got you. The automatic bids for the NIT are given to any team that is the regular season champion of its conference but fails to earn a berth in March Madness.
There you
The rest
go.
of the field is determined regardless of conference after all 68 teams are selected for the NCAA tournament.
So that's part
And
one.
I think you have to go above 500. I think that's also the rule.
I think you're right. Yeah.
I think there's a rule there as well. But You were spot on. That is
So
certainly part of the automatic bid process.
so part one is just flip it.
Mm-hmm.
Still reward these teams. The other two things I would say, that's sort of my answer, is what do you do to make it meaningful? But also it should carry weight for NCAA tournament seeding and for bubble teams, which doesn't specifically apply to mid majors most of the time. But those games should absolutely matter when you're looking at overall body of work. And you should jump a couple seed lines if you go win your conference tournament and beat that many good teams over that short of a period of time. And the other thing that I think it still matters is just in terms of building momentum for the NCAA tournament. I will use that UConn team, Kemba Walker's UConn team, as an example. Does UConn win the national championship if UConn doesn't play in the Big East tournament?
No, but you could also argue that they don't make the tournament at all. I don't remember specifically. This is the inverse here to this.
Right.
This thing. I mean, Butler goes to the Final Four to the national championship to the national championship game 2 years in a row, and they would have probably made it the first year, but they wouldn't have made it the second. They didn't have a resume as a mid-major team in the Horizon League that year in particular in 2011 to get all the way to the national championship game. But you're right, more times than not, the inverse would be true, that the regular season champion would have a chance to, and maybe Butler actually won the regular season both of those times. That might be what you're checking there. But there's also an inverse to this, that there are teams that have gone on runs as a result of winning their conference tournament when they might not have been around otherwise. Like Davidson with Steph Curry would not have gone to the tournament. They didn't go to the tournament the year after they went to the Elite Eight because they didn't win their conference tournament, and you had no Steph Curry in the tournament. I don't know if they actually won their conference that year, but the point is still the same.
Right. So here's what I would say to that is, first, if you're that bad in the regular season, you can't get in to the NCAA tournament. I just don't feel that bad if a hypothetical deep run got taken away. And that UConn team, it's funny because we think about them winning all those games in the Big East tournament. That UConn team was 32-9. They went undefeated in the non-conference portion of that schedule.
Oh, and they won the Maui too that year. You're right.
Their resume was actually a lot, and I had forgotten about this too until I started looking at it when we did our top 100 college basketball players at 110sportsmedia.com, was they were ridiculously good and then they played in the brutal Big East and went 500. But they were still a 500 Big East team that had a great non-conference. They were going to get in. So I just don't think that happens all that often. And to me, you've got to be – I'm just a big believer in being consistent over a long period of time.
Yeah.
And so the idea of just in the NCAA tournament falls into this category too. I mean, it's a fantastic event. I'm not saying we need to change the NCAA tournament. But there's just something about all it takes is a couple weeks or a couple good games, and it changes everything, that drives me nuts.
Yeah, so I guess first of all, I completely agree with the point. Since it's the first time I said anything on it, to say that first, I completely agree with your point. One thing I've been thinking about, and I echo a lot of what you guys have said, and I like your point. I agree with it, and I agree with a lot of what you guys are saying. One thing I've thought about is I kind of flipped it in my head as you've been talking. What about the idea if the conference tournament winner isn't your automatic bid to the NCAA tournament, could that lead to fewer incentives for mediocre or weaker teams in a conference to compete down the stretch in that tournament? Right, like if you're going into that tournament and you've got teams, like the whole part of what's part of what makes, especially in those higher level conferences where even the lower level teams are good teams, what is their incentive in those tournaments going to be to compete? Because there's always been this idea in these bigger conferences that even the team that's 6th, 7th, 8th in the conference could conceivably in these bigger conferences win the conference tournament. Not that it's happening all the time, could win the conference tournament. So they're going to play hard in that tournament. But if there's no chance that it matters for them and they're not going to make the NCAA tournament, like what based on another I'm losing my train of thought. Like, what's the incentives for those teams to play hard in those conference tournaments and make them competitive throughout? That would be my concern. One of my concerns.
And I can answer that, and then we can move on to Josh's ejection. I would say a couple things. One is the last time a team that wasn't going to make the NCAA tournament won a major conference tournament. That even with the added incentive of knowing you would go to the big dance if you win, none of those teams that aren't going win.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, I still think that there's whether it's either going to the NIT or just there's still a prestige that comes with winning your conference tournament. You can still hang a banner and you can still say that you were Big Ten ACC tournament champions. I don't think it takes away from that part of it.
But in the lower level conferences, but in those other conferences where those conferences aren't getting more than 1 or 2 bids, then those other teams don't have a reason to compete in those conference tournaments anymore.
That's why I think the NIT thing is really important.
Yeah.
That you're looking, the NIT still matters, especially for those lower conferences, because if you go in knowing that you're not an NCAA tournament caliber team resume wise, you still have an opportunity to play against good teams, to raise the profile of your program, to build for next year in the NIT.
Right.
So,
you just don't have the chance to make that real Cinderella run.
Right.
And
I would just argue that the teams that, with the exception of UMBC, the teams that make those Cinderella runs are the teams that deserve to be in the NCAA tournament.
Okay.
Which is usually the case.
Yeah.
All right, my ejection is very all-encompassing. It has nothing to do with an individual sport and everything to do with the people who write about, talk about, watch, listen, and talk on social media about sports.
Oh, I'm intrigued.
We need badly to eject the normalization of attacking and insulting and belittling people for having different sports opinions than you.
Oh, yeah.
It is so freaking toxic. The sports world is so toxic. I mean, maybe not as much as the political world, but it's incredible how mean people are on social media just because people think that LeBron is the GOAT instead of Michael Jordan. I'm so over these people hiding behind computer screens, calling people names and just being jerks to each other for having different sports opinions. It's a game. Hello? It's a game. And we yell and scream at each other about it like it's the end of the world. And it is the only thing on a consistent basis, and this is why this is my ejection. It is the only thing on a consistent basis that makes me ever question why I chose to do this career for a living, why I chose to be a part of the sports media world, to be a personality of sorts, whatever you want, whatever word you want to use, that is more public than people who work at a bank or people who are doctors or people who are, it is the only thing that makes me question on a consistent basis why I chose a career that is so public. And it makes me, it frankly makes me sad. It's the same idea as it's a tragedy that we have to tell women in sports that they're probably going to be sexually assaulted if they're in sports. It sucks that you have to prepare yourself to be called stupid, to be called an idiot, to be called names that I'd just rather not say on this podcast if you just want to be involved in the sports world in general, not be a sports media member, just be a sports watcher and sports, someone who wants to talk to other people who watch the sports about those sports. It drives me crazy. It makes me sad, and it needs to be gone, even though I realize this is one of those ones that I have no answer for when it comes to trying to fix it. It's just the thing that needs to go, and people just need to be decent to each other, especially now. Let's just be decent to each other, especially when we're talking about a freaking basketball. Like it's incredible how much it doesn't matter at the end of the day, and people just need to be nicer. So that's my ejection. Let's get it out of here. It's so toxic and so not fun at times, and it puts a downer on something that should very rarely have anything making it not a lot of fun because it's a game and it's entertainment.
Absolutely. And it's not exactly what you were talking about, but I think you could also throw in players to that category of
Certainly.
just the nasty things that people say on social media to players and attack them as people.
Yes.
It's one thing to provide analysis or give your perspective on something, whether that's just your perspective or it's directed towards a particular player. That doesn't necessarily mean that you think they're an awful human being or anything. But there are these people that feel entitled to just say whatever they want to athletes and act like they don't have feelings and they should be perfect and all of those things. That was just the first thing that came to my mind because I'm with you. It's one of those things that I think about whether I really want to do this. Is, do I want to get into an environment where anything I might say negatively about an athlete can be even, I know what my intentions are, but it could even be construed because it's just so common that people just say nasty things about athletes all the time and say nasty things to each other. That's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, sports, politics, just generally, we're so deep into social media that it's going to be incredibly difficult to dig ourselves out, but that doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean things don't need to change. I'm totally with you.
And there's so many things, like you said, Josh, that are obviously the political world is very toxic. That's nothing new, but there are so many things that are actually really worth fighting for if you really believe in it, whether it's a politician who represents you who you don't believe is taking the right actions, or fighting institutional racism, or fighting for things that you really care about. I mean, things that are, there are so many things that are worth fighting for, whatever, no matter what side of the situation, of a topic in the political government world that you believe in. There's so many things in that world that are worth fighting for and pushing for. But this toxicity in the sports world just isn't working to accomplish any goals that are actually making people's lives any better. I mean, the whole idea of, like civil engagement when it comes to politics and all these things, it's to make people's lives better is the end goal. Now, of course, there's all sorts of mess in the situation, but at the end of the day, it's to try to make, your life, the lives of other people better. But this toxicity that we're seeing in the sports world isn't going to ever accomplish any of those things in any way. So I'm completely, I think that's a really good point. And that's just sort of the idea that came to my mind. It's like, what are you accomplishing? What's the positive way that this can play out? Versus, obviously there are things in the political realm that are very toxic and aren't going to end in positive results. But the process overall of critiquing in the political world is to try to get better real life experiences, and that's not going to happen by, no matter how you spin your criticism in the sports world. It's typically not to do those kind of things. Yeah, so that's the end of my point. I think you made a really good point there, Josh.